Welcome back to Poirot Files. Today we're diving into an intriguing mystery, Hercule Poirot and the bride who disappeared after saying "I do," a tale of deception, secrets, and Poirot's brilliant investigative mind. But before that, I want to say you've shown me so much love and I truly appreciate it. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Grab your coffee and let's get started. Chapter 1. A Wedding to Remember. The morning light streamed through the tall, arched windows of Harrowfield Manor, casting golden reflections upon the polished marble floors. The estate, nestled in the heart of the English countryside, was a vision of timeless elegance, its grand halls adorned with fresh white lilies and trailing ivy. As I, Captain Arthur Hastings, stepped into the opulent drawing-room, I could not help but marvel at the spectacle before me. Lords and ladies in their finest attire conversed in hushed tones, their laughter mingling with the distant strains of a string quartet. It was a wedding of considerable note, the union of Miss Lilian Harrow, daughter of the late shipping magnate, Charles Harrow, to Lord Edward Strathmore, a man of noble lineage and, by all accounts, steady character. At my side, Hercule Poirot surveyed the room with his usual keen interest. His moustache, meticulously groomed, twitched ever so slightly as he observed the assembled guests. "A most interesting affair, mon ami," he murmured, straightening the lapels of his impeccable grey suit. "Indeed, Poirot," I agreed. "It is not every day one is invited to such a grand occasion." "No. But such occasions, I find, often contain more than meets the eye." He cast a sharp glance at a group of gentlemen deep in conversation by the fireplace. "Tell me, Hastings, what do you observe?" I followed his gaze. "A few members of the nobility, I'd wager. That stout fellow is Lord Blackwood, known for his love of horse racing. The younger man with the monocle, Viscount Redmayne, I believe." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Bon! And yet, see there, the man who stands slightly apart." I turned and noticed a thin, pale man, his evening suit slightly ill-fitting, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the room. There was something vaguely out of place about him, though I could not immediately say what. "An acquaintance of the family, perhaps?" I ventured. Poirot smiled faintly. "Perhaps." Before I could question him further, a ripple of movement swept through the room. The guests turned toward the grand staircase as Lilian Harrow, radiant in lace and silk, descended arm in arm with her new husband. She was a striking woman, tall with dark, expressive eyes and a playful smile that spoke of a spirit not easily tamed. Edward Strathmore, in contrast, was the picture of English reserve, his expression one of quiet pride as he guided his bride through the gathering. The reception proceeded with all the expected pleasantries. Speeches were made, glasses were raised, and laughter echoed through the manor. The bride was a vision of happiness, her laughter bright as she danced with her new husband beneath the shimmering chandelier. Poirot observed it all, his eyes never idle. As the evening waned, the couple prepared to depart for their honeymoon. Lilian, ever the lively spirit, excused herself for a moment, laughing as she promised to return in mere minutes. But minutes passed, then more. The mood in the room shifted from light amusement to puzzled murmurs. Guests exchanged glances, and Lord Edward checked his pocket watch. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a slight chuckle, "it appears my wife enjoys making an entrance, and, it seems, an exit as well." A few guests chuckled, though the laughter was uneasy. Poirot's brows drew together. "Come, Hastings," he murmured, moving toward the hallway. We reached the dressing-room where Lilian had last been seen. The door was ajar. Inside, the scent of roses lingered, but there was no sign of the bride, only the ghostly sight of her wedding dress draped across a chaise lounge, the veil pooled on the floor as though hastily discarded. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "Good heavens, Poirot, where could she have gone?" He picked up the veil, examining it with the utmost care. His expression was unreadable. "A bride does not vanish into thin air, mon ami," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "There is a crime afoot." Chapter 2. The Vanishing Bride. The room was silent, but for the faint rustling of the lace-trimmed curtains as a cool night breeze crept in through the open window. The wedding dress, so recently worn with such joy, lay discarded on the chaise lounge, a ghostly reminder of its missing owner. Lord Edward Strathmore stood in the doorway, his face ashen. This is madness," he muttered. "She was here only moments ago." Poirot, ever composed, cast his sharp gaze over the scene. He moved carefully about the room, his patent leather shoes clicking against the parquet floor, as he observed each detail with deliberate scrutiny. I glanced at Edward. "My dear fellow, did Lilian seem at all unsettled before she left?" He hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, but Poirot noticed. "Not unsettled, no," he said at last. "Lilian was in fine spirits all evening." He paused, his hands clenching at his sides. "But you must understand, she had a rather whimsical nature." "Whimsical, mon cher Lord Strathmore?" Poirot echoed, lifting a dark eyebrow. Edward exhaled sharply. "She had a habit of mischief, games. She delighted in shocking people. When we were first engaged, she vanished for 2 days, only to turn up at a masquerade ball in Paris, laughing as though it were all a grand jest." I frowned. "But surely she wouldn't abandon her own wedding night in such a manner." Edward's jaw tightened, but before he could reply, a commotion arose in the hallway. Lady Harrow, the bride's mother, entered the room in a rustle of silk and a cloying scent of lavender. Her face, usually so carefully composed, was stark with alarm. "Edward, what is this nonsense?" she demanded. "Where is Lilian?" Edward rubbed a hand over his face. We don't know." Lady Harrow swayed for a moment, her fingers tightening on the pearl choker at her throat. "She would not do this," she whispered. "Not this time." Poirot's gaze flickered toward her. "Ah, madame, this is not the first time your daughter has disappeared unexpectedly." She hesitated, as though regretting her words. "Lilian was spirited," she said finally. "But she would never run away on her wedding night." A low murmur from the doorway drew our attention. The servants had gathered, whispering in uneasy voices. "It's the Harrow curse," one of the footmen muttered. "Curse?" I repeated, stepping forward. Poirot remained still, watching the exchange with quiet intensity. An older maid, her lined face grave, stepped forward. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said, "but misfortune has long followed the Harrow women." Lilian's grandmother, Eleanor Harrow, vanished on the eve of her engagement. They found her body weeks later, floating in the river. Lady Harrow drew a sharp breath. "Superstitious nonsense," she snapped. "This has nothing to do with—" Poirot held up a hand. "Pardon, madam. It is always wise to consider every possibility, no?" His eyes swept the room once more. Then, with great care, he bent and plucked something from the floor. A single strand of hair. He held it up to the light. It was long, dark, and unmistakably different from Lilian's golden curls. I leaned in. "Odd," I murmured. "Could it belong to one of the maids?" Poirot twirled the strand between his fingers, deep in thought. Then, with a satisfied nod, He slipped it into a small envelope. "The puzzle takes shape," he murmured. "But, mon ami, we must tread carefully. A bride does not simply vanish. Someone has made her disappear." Chapter 3. The Guests and Their Secrets. The hour had grown late, and yet no one at Harrowfield Manor retired to bed. The disappearance of Lilian Harrow, so sudden and inexplicable, had cast a pall over what had been an evening of grandeur and celebration. The great hall, which had moments ago been filled with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses, now buzzed with murmured speculations and wary glances. Servants moved uneasily through the corridors, and the guests gathered in small clusters, whispering theories in hushed tones. Poirot, standing at the centre of the grand drawing-room, was the picture of composed authority. His hands rested lightly behind his back, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests like a schoolmaster surveying his pupils. I knew that behind those sharp grey eyes the little grey cells were already at work. "It is imperative, mes amis, that we establish a timeline," he said, his voice crisp. "From the moment the bride was last seen to the moment her absence was noticed, precision is of the utmost importance." Lord Strathmore, still pale but visibly composing himself, cleared his throat. "She left the reception at approximately 10:15. She told me she needed but a moment." His fingers tightened at his sides. "She never returned." "And was there anything in her manner to suggest distress?" Poirot asked. Edward hesitated, his gaze flickering downward. "She was smiling, laughing even, but I sensed something beneath it, a nervousness." He exhaled sharply. "I should have pressed her about it, but I thought it was simply nerves." Poirot gave a small nod, but his gaze remained fixed on Edward. "And before the wedding, mon cher? Did she confide any worries?" Edward's jaw tightened. He hesitated for a long moment, and then, as though making a decision, he spoke. "Yes," he admitted. "Lilian was afraid." A hush fell over the room. I saw Lady Harrow stiffen, her face unreadable. "Afraid of what, Lord Strathmore?" Poirot asked gently. Edward shook his head. "That she wouldn't say. Only that she had a feeling, an overwhelming dread that something terrible would happen." Poirot studied him a moment longer, then turned his attention to the guests. "Now, mesdames et messieurs, I must ask each of you where you were between 10 and past." A ripple of unease spread through the room. People exchanged glances, their expressions wary. Poirot's method was relentless, and already the air was thick with tension. A woman stepped forward, draped in deep burgundy satin, her dark eyes flashing. I recognized her instantly, Madeleine Durand, the famous French actress. She had been seated near us at dinner, laughing gaily and drinking far more than was advisable. "Monsieur Poirot, you suspect one of us?" she asked, a delicate brow arching. Poirot smiled faintly. "I suspect nothing, madame. I merely gather the facts," she exhaled, shaking her head. "Very well. At 10 o'clock I was speaking with Lord Redmayne in the library." The Viscount, a thin, angular man with a prominent nose and a perpetual air of boredom, inclined his head. "That is correct. Miss Durand and I were discussing—" He hesitated. Well, she was discussing her latest performance, and I was attempting to listen. A murmur of laughter flickered through the room, but Poirot remained unmoved. Another guest spoke up, a broad-shouldered man with grizzled hair. Mr. Howard Lytton, a friend of the Harrow family, known for his frequent travels to Egypt. "I was on the terrace, smoking," he said. "Alone." Poirot tilted his head. "Did you see anyone?" Lytton frowned. "Now that you mention it, yes. There was someone in the gardens, a figure moving near the hedge maze. Lady Eleanor, Lillian's stepmother, let out a small gasp. Dressed in severe black, she had remained silent until now, watching the proceedings with an expression of tightly controlled emotion. "I saw it too," she said quietly. "A hooded figure. Just after Lillian left the hall." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "You are certain, madam?" Lady Eleanor nodded. "I thought nothing of it at the time. Perhaps a servant—" Poirot lifted a hand. "No, madam. A hooded figure in the gardens just as the bride disappears. This, you see, is not coincidence." The tension in the room thickened. I could almost hear the racing thoughts of the guests, each wondering whether they had overlooked something. Whether they had seen too much or too little? Poirot turned back to Lady Eleanor. "Tell me, madam, your relationship with Mademoiselle Lillian. It was cordial." Lady Eleanor's lips pressed together. "We were not close. Lillian was young, impulsive. She did not always approve of me. And yet you were the one to notice the figure outside," Poirot murmured. A flicker of something passed over Lady Eleanor's face. Fear, perhaps, or indignation. "You think I had something to do with this?" she said coldly. Poirot shook his head. "I think, madame, that you know more than you realize." She exhaled sharply, but said no more. Poirot turned back to Lord Strathmore. "A final question, mon cher. Did Mademoiselle Lillian have any former admirers?" Edward's expression darkened. "There was one. Gerald Mason. He and Lillian were once engaged." I glanced at Poirot sharply. That was news to me. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And where is this Monsieur Mason now?" Edward hesitated. "I don't know. He left England some time ago, but—" His voice dropped. "He wrote to her 3 days before the wedding." A heavy silence fell. Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "You still have this letter?" Edward nodded stiffly. "Yes, it's in my study." Poirot gave a small, satisfied nod. "Then, mon ami, let us begin there." Chapter 4. A mysterious letter. The house had settled into a tense, watchful silence. Though the guests had been dismissed to their rooms, none seemed willing to sleep. Whispers drifted through the hallways, shadows flickered under lamplight, and the air in Harrowfield Manor felt thick with unanswered questions. Lord Strathmore led us to his study, a dark, richly panelled room lined with shelves of old leather-bound books and a mahogany desk that bore the weight of years of serious deliberations. He moved with stiffness, his usual aristocratic composure betrayed by the tightness of his jaw and the way his hands trembled slightly as he unlocked a drawer. "The letter arrived 3 days ago," he said, retrieving a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. "Lillian said little about it. She appeared troubled, but dismissed my concerns. I should have pressed her." Poirot took the letter with delicate care, his fingertips brushing lightly over the surface before he unfolded it. I leaned in beside him, my curiosity piqued. The handwriting was elegant but forceful, each stroke deliberate, almost urgent. "Do not marry him. It is not safe. If you value your life, leave before it is too late." There was no signature. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured. His fingers traced the inked lines as if feeling for some hidden meaning. A warning, and yet unsigned. A person who fears to reveal themselves, but one who cares for Mademoiselle Lillian's well-being. Edward exhaled sharply. Who would send such a thing, and why? "That is what we must determine, mon cher." Poirot turned the letter over, examining the back. And see, there is no postal mark, meaning it was delivered by hand. Edward's brows furrowed. By someone inside the house? Or someone who had access to it, Poirot corrected. We were silent for a moment, absorbing this new twist in the mystery. Poirot then folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Now, Hastings, let us take a detour to Mademoiselle Lillian's room. There is much to be learned there. We ascended the grand staircase, our footsteps echoing through the dimly lit corridors. The house felt different now, as if the very walls held their breath. Inside Lillian's bedroom, everything remained as it had been earlier that evening, her vanity table adorned with fine silver brushes, a half-burned candle flickering on the bedside table. A faint scent of lilacs lingered in the air. Poirot moved with measured intent, his gaze scanning every surface, every detail. He opened the wardrobe, examining its contents, then moved to the small writing desk by the window. A stack of correspondence lay neatly arranged, a few invitations, a bank statement, but no letters resembling the one we had just seen. He picked up a fountain pen, turning it in his fingers. The ink, he murmured, still fresh. I watched as he carefully opened a drawer revealing a bundle of old letters tied with a satin ribbon. Love letters, I guessed, perhaps. Poirot untied the ribbon, sifting through the pages. Ah, these are from Gerald Mason. Edward tensed at the name. They were engaged once, he admitted. Years ago, but Lillian ended it. Poirot nodded. And yet he wrote to her still. He set the letters aside and continued his search. Then, as he opened the final drawer, his hand stilled. Inside, nestled among the papers, was another letter, one that bore an uncanny resemblance to the warning found in Edward's study. Poirot lifted it carefully. The same hurried script, the same urgent warning, but this one was torn, as if Lillian had crumpled it in frustration. 2 warnings, Poirot murmured, and yet she said nothing. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. A uniformed officer, the local constable, entered, his hat in hand. He was a stocky fellow with a thick moustache and the air of a man who had already formed an opinion and saw no need for further inquiry. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said gruffly. "I've been informed of the situation." He sniffed, glancing around the room. "To my mind, there's little mystery here. The young lady's eloped." "Eloped?" I repeated, incredulous. The constable nodded sagely. "A young woman, about to be married to one man, but perhaps in love with another. These things happen. Run off in the dead of night, ashamed to face her family." Poirot merely smiled, that small, knowing smile of his. "And yet, mon cher officer, there are inconsistencies in your theory." "Oh?" Poirot gestured to the dressing-room. "Would a bride who planned to elope leave her wedding dress abandoned in such a way? Would she leave behind her jewellery, her luggage, everything she possessed? And tell me, monsieur, have you ever known a woman to run away voluntarily with neither a coat nor a hat?" The constable opened his mouth, hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Well, perhaps she left in a hurry." "Non," Poirot said smoothly. "This was not an elopement. Something else happened here." The constable grumbled, but said no more. Poirot turned his attention to the staircase as we exited the room, his gaze sweeping along the polished wood. And then he stopped. He bent down, plucking something from the floor. A small, luminous pearl glistening under the dim lighting. I frowned. "A pearl?" Poirot held it up. "Oui, mon ami, And not just any pearl, but one that belongs to a
missing necklace. Edward inhaled sharply. Lillian's necklace. She wore it tonight. Then how did it come to be here, lost upon the staircase?
Poirot murmured. Unless, of course, it was torn from her in a struggle. Silence hung between us. Poirot turned the pearl over in his palm, his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. No, mes amis, this was not an elopement. This was something far more sinister. Chapter 5. The Groom's Alibi. The house remained draped in uneasy silence, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards or the muffled murmur of voices behind closed doors. Though the hour was late, sleep had eluded everyone in Harrowfield Manor. The night's events had shaken even the most composed of guests, and uncertainty clung to the air like a lingering mist. Poirot and I returned to Lord Strathmore's study, where the young groom sat, hands clasped tightly together, his brow furrowed in troubled thought. He had removed his wedding jacket, and his shirt sleeves were slightly crumpled, as if he had run his hands over them repeatedly in frustration. A decanter of brandy sat untouched at his side. Poirot settled himself in a high-backed chair across from him, steepling his fingertips. Now, mon cher Lord Strathmore, I must trouble you with more questions. Edward exhaled sharply, leaning back. Ask what you must. Poirot nodded, his gaze sharp. Your relationship with Mademoiselle Lillian, it was, how shall we say, a happy one? Edward stiffened. Yes, of course. Poirot merely tilted his head. But there was tension, no? A flicker of something passed over Edward's face. Every couple has their disagreements. Ah, Poirot said smoothly. Then you will not object to telling me what was the subject of your most recent disagreement? Edward hesitated, and I saw his fingers twitch slightly before he clasped his hands more firmly. It was nothing of consequence, he said at last. A foolish quarrel the night before the wedding. Poirot's expression did not change, but I saw the gleam of interest in his eyes. And yet, mon cher, a quarrel so near to the wedding.
Day, it is not so insignificant, I think. Edward sighed and rubbed his temple. Lillian was distracted, distant. I could see it in her. When I pressed her, she was evasive. She told me it was nerves, but I knew better. I asked her if she was having second thoughts. His jaw tightened. She denied it, but I wasn't convinced. And then? She became upset. Told me to stop imagining things, that I was being ridiculous. He exhaled. We parted on uneasy terms. Poirot was silent for a moment. And you saw her after that? Edward shook his head. Not until
the wedding itself. Poirot considered this before asking, Did Mademoiselle Lillian ever confide in you about someone she feared? Edward hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but she refused to name them. I exchanged a glance with Poirot. This aligned too well with the anonymous warnings she had received. Before Poirot could respond, there was a soft knock at the study door. It opened to reveal Mrs. Danby, the housekeeper, her usually composed expression tinged with unease. Begging, Your pardon, my lord, but I thought you ought to know some of the servants have been talking. Edward frowned. About what? Mrs. Danby hesitated before stepping further into the room. Well, sir, about you. Edward sat up straighter. Me? Poirot's gaze sharpened. Pray continue, madame. Mrs. Danby smoothed her apron, clearly reluctant. Some of the maids say they saw his lordship in the corridor last night, near Miss Lillian's room. I turned to Edward at once. Is that true? His expression darkened. I did no such thing. Mrs. Danby shifted uncomfortably.
I only repeat what I heard, my lord. Two of the maids, Annie and Bridget, swear.
They saw you passing down the west corridor not long after Miss Lillian left the reception. Edward exhaled sharply, his temper fraying. I was not there. Poirot studied him for a long moment. Then where were you? Edward hesitated before
answering. I stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, alone.
A convenient alibi, I muttered. Edward's eyes flashed. Are you suggesting I had something to do with this? Poirot lifted a hand. Calm yourself, mon cher. We merely establish the facts. Edward's shoulders were tense, but he said nothing more. Poirot turned back to Mrs. Danby. Madame, you are certain of what the servants claim? The housekeeper pursed her lips. They believe what they saw, sir. Poirot nodded. Then I shall speak with them. As Mrs. Danby excused herself, I turned back to Poirot, lowering my voice. Surely this is significant, Poirot. If the servants saw him there, it suggests he might have confronted Lillian before she vanished. Poirot tapped a finger against his lips. Oui, mon ami, but assumptions are dangerous. We must verify, not simply accept. I sighed in frustration. But you cannot deny that Strathmore's behaviour is suspicious. Poirot merely smiled. Suspicious, perhaps, but guilty. That remains to be seen. Chapter 6. A Deadly Family. Secret. The morning light filtered through the heavy drapes of Harrowfield Manor, but it did little to lift the gloom that had settled over the house. The guests remained subdued, whispering among themselves, while the servants carried on with their duties under a cloud of unease. The bride was still missing, and the great detective, Hercule Poirot, had much work to do. We sat in the drawing-room, where the fire crackled low in the hearth. Poirot, ever meticulous, adjusted the lapels of his jacket before leaning forward, his sharp eyes fixed upon Lady Eleanor Harrow, Lillian's stepmother. She was an imposing woman, elegantly dressed, in deep blue, her dark hair streaked with silver. A woman accustomed to control, yet this morning she was not quite herself. Her hands, though graceful, trembled ever so slightly as she lifted her teacup. A woman, nervous, not with grief, but with something else. Mademoiselle Lillian's disappearance. It has unsettled you greatly, madame, Poirot observed. Lady Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. It is a tragedy, she said carefully. One can only hope she will be found soon. Poirot tilted his head slightly. Perhaps. But tell me, madame, do you believe she vanished of her own accord? She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before setting her cup down with a quiet clink. I do not know what to believe, Monsieur Poirot. Her voice was steady, but Poirot's gaze did not waver. You knew her well, yes? As well as anyone, she answered, her tone clipped. I married her father when she was only a girl. She was headstrong, impulsive. A woman of strong passions, then. She was emotional, Lady Eleanor admitted, particularly regarding matters of family. Poirot leaned back, steepling his fingertips. Ah, yes, family. It is an interesting thing, is it not? A bond that can bring great joy or great suffering. Lady Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the fire. What are you implying, Monsieur Poirot? Merely an observation? Madame. Poirot's voice was light, almost careless. You see, I have heard whispers of an old feud between the Harrow and Strathmore families, a bitter history that some have not forgotten. Lady Eleanor stiffened. That is nonsense. Is it? Poirot's tone was mild. Then you will not mind if I ask what became of the letter? The silence that followed was palpable. For the first time, Lady Eleanor's composure faltered. A flicker of something, fear perhaps, crossed her face. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by cool indifference.
"What letter?"
"The one said to be written by your late husband, madam," Poirot said smoothly. "The one that, according to rumour, contained certain revelations." Her fingers tightened against the fabric of her gown. "That is nothing but an old tale. My husband wrote no such letter." Poirot smiled. "And yet people believe otherwise. People believe many foolish things." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Perhaps. But tell me, madame, what was your relationship with your stepdaughter?" Lady Eleanor's gaze turned cold. "I did my duty by Lilian." "A careful choice of words," Poirot murmured. "She lifted her chin. She was not my daughter." A silence stretched between them. I shifted uncomfortably, watching as Lady Eleanor turned her attention back to the fire, as though dismissing Poirot's questions entirely. Before Poirot could press further, the door swung open and a nervous-looking maid entered. "Begging your pardon, my lady," she said, wringing her hands, "but Mr. Gerald Mason is here." Edward Strathmore, who had been standing near the window, turned sharply. "Gerald Mason?" "The same," the maid said. "He says he must speak with you at once, my lord." Edward glanced toward Poirot, then back at the maid. "Send him in." Moments later, a man strode into the room. He was tall, with dark hair, and a confident air about him, but there was something restless in his eyes. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on Edward before he finally spoke. "I received."
"A letter?" he said, his voice tight. "From Lilian?" Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "Indeed," Gerald nodded. "It arrived this morning. She wrote it before the wedding."
He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket and handed it to Poirot. Poirot unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words. "Gerald, I need to speak with you. There is something I must tell you before it is too late. I fear I have made a terrible mistake. Please, meet me in the gardens before the wedding. I will explain everything then." There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably Lilian's. Poirot handed the letter to me, and I read it with growing unease. "You went to the gardens?" Poirot asked. Gerald's jaw tightened. "I did, but she never came." Poirot was silent for a long moment. Then, very softly, he said, "It seems, mon ami, that Mademoiselle Lilian was keeping more secrets than we realized." Chapter 7. A witness speaks. The heavy rain that had fallen in the early hours of the morning had left the gardens damp. The earth softened just enough to betray the hurried steps of those who had walked its paths. Harrowfield Manor, despite its grandeur, seemed more shadowed than ever under the overcast sky. The disappearance of Lilian Harrow had turned its halls into a place of whispers, speculation, and, if Poirot's sharp gaze was any indication, secrets that were steadily beginning to unravel. Poirot and I had just finished examining the letter Gerald Mason had brought when Mrs. Danby, the housekeeper, arrived at the study door, looking uncharacteristically anxious. She hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "Monsieur Poirot, the maid, Alice, has something to say. She's been dithering about it all morning, but I told her she ought to speak up." Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Indeed? Then—"
"Let us not keep Mademoiselle Alice waiting." Mrs. Danby stepped aside and a young maid entered, wringing her hands in her apron. She was a nervous thing with red hair tucked under her cap and eyes that darted toward the door as if she longed
to flee. Poirot, ever the master of putting people at ease, smiled at her kindly. "Come, Mademoiselle Alice, there is nothing to fear. You have seen something, yes?" Alice hesitated, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her apron. "Yes, sir." "And
"What was it that you saw?" she swallowed. "I saw Miss Lillian leave the house, sir." A hush settled over the room.
even Edward Strathmore, who had remained stiffly silent since Gerald Mason's arrival, turned sharply toward her. Poirot's expression did not change, but I could see the way his fingers pressed together, the way his little grey cells were stirring. "Tell."
"Me everything, mademoiselle." Alice nodded, inhaling deeply as if to steady herself. It was after the wedding. After the guests had started whispering about her being gone too long. I was near the servants' staircase when I saw her. Poirot
Leaned forward slightly. "And she was alone?" Alice shook her head. "No, sir, she wasn't." Edward took a step forward. "Who was with her?" Alice's gaze flickered toward him before returning to Poirot. "I don't know, sir. It was a man, but I didn't see his face." Poirot's voice was gentle but insistent. "Describe what you did see, mademoiselle." Alice nodded rapidly. "He was tall, taller than Miss Lillian, and he wore a dark coat, heavy-like. Could have been black or navy, I can't say for certain. They were walking toward the side gate." "The side gate?" I echoed. Alice bobbed her head. "Aye, sir. The one that leads toward the old path by the woods." Edward looked stricken. "You're saying she left willingly?" Alice hesitated. I think so, my lord. They weren't struggling, nor did she call for help. It was as though she was going with him of her own choice." A silence fell, each of us processing the implications of her words. Poirot, however, did not look surprised. He merely nodded thoughtfully. "Merci, Mademoiselle Alice. You have been most helpful." Alice dipped a quick curtsy and practically fled from the room. Edward ran a hand through his hair. "She left of her own free will?" He turned to Poirot. "What does that mean?" Poirot only lifted a hand. "Patience, my dear Lord Strathmore. We must now verify what we have been told. Without—"
"Another word." He rose and strode toward the door.
I followed, hurrying to keep pace. "Where are we going, Poirot?" He did not slow. "To the side gate, Hastings. It is time to see what the ground will tell us." The rain had made the grass damp, and the scent of earth and foliage filled the air as we reached the old wrought-iron gate at the far end of the property. It had clearly not been used in some time. Ivy had begun to creep around its edges, and the hinges let out a groan when Poirot pushed it open. But it was the ground just beyond the gate that drew his attention. He dropped to a crouch, studying the soil carefully. I leaned over his shoulder. "What do you see, Poirot?" He pointed. "Footprints, mon ami." And indeed, there they were, faint but visible, leading away from the gate and toward the wooded path beyond. Poirot examined them closely, his fingertips lightly tracing the impressions. "One set is lighter," he murmured. "Mademoiselle."
"Lillian's, without doubt. But the other, see here, Hastings, the deeper imprints. A man, certainly, and he was in a hurry." I frowned. "You think she was being led away hastily?"
Poirot tapped his chin. "It is possible. But let us consider an alternative. What if Mademoiselle Lillian was not merely following, but running?" A chill ran down my spine. "You mean she was fleeing?" Poirot straightened, brushing the damp from his trousers. "Perhaps, Hastings, but the question remains, fleeing from what?" Before I could respond, a voice called out from behind us, "Poirot! Hastings!" We turned to see a breathless young constable hurrying toward us from the main house. His face was pale, his eyes wide. Poirot lifted an eyebrow. "Yes, Mon ami, the constable swallowed hard before speaking. They've found something in the woods. Poirot's expression did not change, but I saw his fingers tighten slightly. And what, pray, have they found? The constable hesitated. A piece of torn fabric, sir, caught on a branch. I exhaled sharply. And? The constable lowered his voice. It's from a wedding dress, sir. Poirot exchanged a glance with me before murmuring, Alors, Hastings, the game, it is truly afoot. Chapter 8. The False Bride. The morning after the discovery of the torn wedding dress fabric, Poirot and I found ourselves once again in Harrowfield Manor's grand but gloomy study. The rain had ceased, but the sky remained an unbroken stretch of grey, mirroring the tense atmosphere that hung over the household. The disappearance of Lilian Harrow had settled over the estate like an unwelcome guest, whispering through the halls and casting long shadows over all who remained. Poirot had been unusually quiet since our return from the woods. He had sat at the writing desk, fingers steepled, eyes closed, lost in thought. I, on the other hand, was restless. The entire affair gnawed at me, the footprints, the torn fabric, the unknown man in the dark coat. Every new clue only seemed to deepen the mystery rather than bring us closer to its resolution. I was about to speak when a sharp knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Gerald Mason entered, his expression grave. Monsieur Poirot, I've just received word from Scotland Yard. He hesitated. There's been a sighting. I sat up straighter. A sighting? You mean Lilian? Mason nodded. A woman matching her description was seen in London late. Last night, she was wearing a wedding dress. For the first time in hours, Poirot's eyes snapped open. He studied Mason closely. Where in London? The report came from the Criterion Hotel. The night manager swears he saw a young woman in a bridal gown enter the establishment accompanied by a man.
They only stayed briefly, and when they left, the woman appeared distressed. I leapt to my feet. Poirot, this could be it. If she was seen in London, she may be trying to contact someone. We must go at once. But Poirot remained seated,
unmoved by my enthusiasm. Instead, he regarded Mason with an unreadable expression. Tell me, mon ami, was the gentleman with her described? Mason hesitated. The manager couldn't get a clear look. He only said the man was well dressed and that they left in a motor car. Poirot sighed softly and turned to me. You are eager to pursue, Hastings, but before we rush to London there is something I must examine first. I frowned. What on earth could be more important than following this lead? He rose, dusted a speck of lint from his sleeve, and gestured toward the staircase. Come, my friend, we must pay a visit to Mademoiselle Lilian's luggage. I groaned, but followed him upstairs, Mason trailing behind us. Lilian's room had remained largely untouched since her disappearance. Her trunk stood neatly at the foot of the bed, waiting for an owner who had not returned. Poirot moved toward them with purpose, carefully unlatching the lid of the largest trunk. He rifled through the contents with delicate precision, removing a folded silk shawl, a silver hairbrush, and a small jewelry case before finally pausing at a slip of paper tucked beneath a lace handkerchief. With a flick of his fingers, he retrieved it and held it up to the light. Ah, he murmured, what have we here? I moved closer, reading the words scrawled upon it. Do not trust him. The note was unsigned. A cold feeling settled over me. Who wrote this? Poirot studied it for a long moment before carefully placing it in his pocket. That, Hastings, is a most important question. Mason frowned. But who is him referring to? Poirot's eyes flickered toward the doorway, as if considering an answer. but instead he simply said, "It is yet too soon to say." I was about to protest when another knock sounded at the door.
A young constable stepped inside, his expression uncertain. "Begging your pardon, sir, but we've just had word from London again." Mason turned sharply. "And?" The constable hesitated. "The woman in the wedding dress, she wasn't Miss Lillian, sir." There was a beat of stunned silence. Mason's brow furrowed. "What?" The constable swallowed. "It was another woman."
Someone deliberately dressed like the bride. A strange tension filled the room. I turned to Poirot. "A red herring?" Poirot inclined his head. "But of course, Hastings. A deliberate distraction designed to send us in the wrong direction." Sui looked troubled. "But why? If Lillian was taken, why stage a false sighting?" Poirot's gaze was unreadable. "Ah, mon cher monsieur, because someone wishes us to believe Lillian is alive and moving freely when in truth she may not be." A shiver ran down my spine. Poirot exhaled and smoothed a hand over his moustache. "This false bride, it tells us something very important." I swallowed. "And what is that?" He turned toward the window, gazing out at the
"Mist-covered grounds. That someone has gone to great lengths to keep us from finding the real bride."
Chapter 9. The Stepmother's Deception. The drawing-room at Harrowfield Manor was dimly lit when Poirot and I entered. The heavy drapes had been drawn against the dreary afternoon light, leaving only the flickering glow of the fireplace to cast shadows upon the room's occupants. Lady Eleanor sat stiffly in a high-backed chair, her fingers twisting a delicate lace handkerchief. Her usual poise had faltered. There was a tightness about her mouth, a nervous tension in her shoulders. She had been avoiding Poirot all morning, but now, with the door firmly closed, there was no escape. Poirot settled into a chair opposite her with deliberate grace. "Madame, I must speak plainly. You have not been truthful." Lady Eleanor's fingers froze upon the fabric. I don't know what you mean, what you—" "Oh, but I think you do," Poirot said softly. "You see, there is a matter most troubling. A letter that was meant for Mademoiselle Lillian never reached her hands. It was intercepted." He leaned forward, his gaze unrelenting. "By you." Sharp intake of breath. Her knuckles whitened against the handkerchief. I glanced at Poirot in surprise. He had not mentioned this theory before, yet he spoke with absolute certainty. Lady Eleanor let out a slow breath. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was unsteady. Poirot tilted his head. "No, madame. You do know. And the time has come to tell the truth." There was a long silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth unable to dispel the chill in the air. Then with a sudden motion, Lady Eleanor pressed the handkerchief to her lips, inhaled deeply, and whispered, "Yes." I took the letter. A flicker of triumph passed through Poirot's eyes. "Ah."
"At last, the truth begins to emerge." I sat forward. "But why? What was in the letter?" She swallowed hard. "I don't know."
Poirot's brow lifted. "I never read it," she continued hurriedly. "It arrived a few days before the wedding. I recognized the handwriting immediately." "And whose handwriting was it, madame?" Poirot asked gently. Lady Eleanor hesitated. Then, almost inaudibly, she said, "My late husband's." A gasp escaped me. Lord Harrow had been dead for years. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "And this alarmed you?" She nodded. I didn't understand it. It was unmistakably—"
"His writing, but how could that be?" "I feared it was some cruel trick." Poirot tapped his fingers together. "So instead of delivering the letter, you kept it hidden." She nodded again. I thought if Lillian saw it, she would be distraught. The wedding was so close. I only
wanted to protect her. Poirot studied her carefully. And where is this letter now? A pained expression crossed her face. I burned it. There was a beat of silence. I groaned inwardly, a vital clue destroyed. Poirot, however, remained unperturbed. And yet you sent a warning note to Mademoiselle Lillian. Lady Eleanor's lips trembled. Yes, I had a terrible feeling something was wrong. That letter, whether real or forged, felt like an omen. I wanted her to be cautious, but she never mentioned receiving my note. Poirot sat back, his expression thoughtful.
Ah, madame, you have been most foolish.
Tears welled in her eyes. I only wanted to protect her. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Did you fear for her safety, madame, or did you fear what that letter might reveal? A single tear slipped down Lady Eleanor's cheek. She did not answer, felt a chill. What secret had Lord Harrow's letter carried? And was it connected to Lillian's disappearance? Poirot, however, was not finished. There is another matter, madam. His voice was softer now, almost coaxing. The pearl necklace, her
head jerked up. What about it?
Poirot's dark eyes gleamed. It has reappeared. In your possession. A stunned silence filled the room. Lady Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed. Her hands clutched at her dress. That's impossible, she whispered. Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew a delicate object, a single pearl. I believe, madame, that this belongs to you. Her fingers trembled as she took the pearl. For a moment, she merely stared at it. Then, in a voice so low I could barely hear, she said, "Where did you find this?" Poirot's expression remained inscrutable. That, madame, is not the question. The question is, how did your missing necklace come to be in your possession once more? Her hands balled into fists. I don't know. A heavy silence. Poirot rose. Ah, madam, I think you know far more than you admit. He smoothed his moustache. And soon we shall know it too. Lady Eleanor said nothing. As we left the room, I turned to Poirot. What do you make of it? Poirot's lips pressed together. She is hiding something, mon ami, and I do not think it is merely an intercepted letter. I frowned. You believe she knows what happened to Lillian? Poirot's eyes gleamed. I believe, Hastings, that she fears the truth will destroy her. And with that ominous thought, we descended the staircase, leaving Lady Eleanor alone. In the dimly lit room, her fingers still curled around the single pearl. Chapter 10. The Disguise. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Lillian's bedchamber, casting long shadows across the room. The air held a faint trace of perfume, floral, delicate, but now tainted with the weight of unanswered questions. Poirot stood before the dressing table, his keen eyes studying its ornate carvings, his fingers tracing the edges with a careful, deliberate touch. I watched him with growing impatience. Really, Poirot, what do you expect to find? The room has already been searched thoroughly. He did not answer immediately, merely pressed a fingertip against the carved floral motif along the drawer's edge. Then, with a quiet click, the panel shifted. I stepped forward in surprise. A hidden compartment? Poirot's lips curved in satisfaction as he reached inside and withdrew a small silk pouch. Carefully, he loosened the drawstrings and let the contents spill into his palm. A lock of hair, long, dark, and unmistakably different from Lillian's fair tresses, lay against his white glove. I stared. Good heavens, that's not Lillian's hair. Précisément. Poirot examined the strands with great interest. And yet, Hastings, it was found within her dressing table. Curious, is it not? My mind struggled to grasp the implication. But why would she have a lock of dark hair? It makes no sense. Poirot replaced the pouch in his pocket, his expression unreadable. No, mon ami, it makes perfect sense. I frowned. You mean this is connected to the strand of dark hair found in the dressing room? Poirot gave a slight nod. And what do we deduce from that? I hesitated. Perhaps someone else was in the dressing room before she disappeared? Poirot sighed, shaking his head. Ah, Hastings, your mind leaps too eagerly. No, let us apply logic, no? We have a bride who vanishes, a dressing table with a secret compartment, and hidden within it, hair that does not match our missing bride. I rubbed my chin. But if it's not Lillian's, then whose? I stopped abruptly, my eyes widening as a most absurd thought occurred to me. Poirot, are you saying? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Enfin, you begin to see. I could scarcely believe the words forming in my mind. Are you saying that the bride was not the bride? Poirot spread his hands. Is it not a fascinating question? I took a step back, feeling as though the floor beneath me had shifted. But that's impossible. Dozens of guests saw Lillian walk down the aisle. Her family, Lord Strathmore, the servants. Poirot lifted a finger. They saw a woman in a wedding dress, but did they truly see Lillian Harrow? The room seemed to spin. But that's preposterous. Why would anyone impersonate her? Ah, that is the question we must answer. Poirot crossed to the wardrobe and opened it. Inside, neatly folded garments lined the shelves. He ran a careful hand along the fabric. We assume too much, mon ami. We assume that Lillian was herself up until the moment she disappeared. But what if? He fell silent, his fingers still against the fabric. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, he withdrew a folded piece of silk, smooth, shimmering, and unmistakably bridal white. A second wedding veil? I exclaimed. Poirot held it up to the light. Mais oui, and look. He pointed to a delicate dark thread caught in the lacework. I leaned closer. Another strand of dark hair. Poirot nodded. You see, Hastings, the pieces begin to fit. Someone, perhaps for only a brief moment, took Lillian Harrow's place. A cold chill ran down my spine. But if the real Lillian was missing before the ceremony, then... I turned to Poirot. Who was it that married Lord Strathmore? Poirot smiled slightly. That, mon cher, is what we must now uncover. The weight of the revelation pressed upon me. The wedding had been a deception, but for what purpose? And more importantly, where was the real Lillian Harrow? Poirot glanced at the dressing table one last time before turning towards the door. Come, Hastings, the final act awaits. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The grand drawing-room of Harrow Manor was thick with tension. The guests and family members, still reeling from the shocking disappearance of Lillian Harrow, sat stiffly in their seats, their eyes darting towards one another in barely concealed suspicion. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows along the dark panelled walls, but no warmth could dispel the unease hanging in the air. Poirot stood at the centre of the room, his small figure radiating quiet authority. His hands were clasped behind his back, his head tilted slightly, as though he were listening to some invisible whisper of truth that only he could hear. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, his voice calm but firm, We have all been laboring under a most dangerous assumption. We have believed that the disappearance of Mademoiselle Lillian occurred after the wedding ceremony. But I tell you—" He paused for effect, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. "That is not so." A ripple of confusion passed through the gathered group. Lord Strathmore, pale and haggard, leaned forward. "Not so?" he repeated hoarsely. "But she walked down the aisle. I married her. I—" His voice faltered, his fingers gripping the arm of his chair. "Ah, mon cher Lord Strathmore, that is where we must be most precise. You stood at the altar. You spoke your vows. But I ask you now with great care, was the woman at your side truly Lillian Harrow?" A stunned silence fell over the room. Lady Eleanor let out a soft gasp. "But that's absurd, is it?" Poirot arched a brow. "We assumed the bride was Lillian because she appeared to be. A wedding gown, a veil, a few whispered words. In the presence of witnesses, et voilà, a bride. But what if I tell you that Mademoiselle Lillian Harrow was never at the altar at all? What if I tell you that the woman who married Lord Strathmore was not Lillian Harrow, but an impostor?" Hastings, seated beside me, let out an audible gasp. "Poirot, but that's impossible." Poirot turned slightly, fixing me with an indulgent smile. "Ah, Hastings, you always believe the impossible until the truth is laid before you. But let us consider the facts, yes?" He took a slow step forward, his gaze falling upon each guest in turn. "Firstly, we have the matter of the strand of dark hair found in the dressing room, a room which belonged to a fair-haired bride. Then we discover a hidden compartment in Mademoiselle Lillian's dressing table, containing another lock of dark hair, carefully preserved. What does this tell us? It tells us that someone with dark hair was in that room." A murmur ran through the assembled group. Lady Eleanor pressed a hand to her throat.
"But surely that proves nothing. A maid, perhaps? A visitor?" Poirot shook his head. "No, madam. The dressing room was secured. No one but Mademoiselle Lillian was meant to be inside." Lord Strathmore's voice was tight. "Are you saying someone took her place?" "Exactement." Poirot clapped his hands together. "The real Mademoiselle Lillian was removed before the ceremony, whether by force or subterfuge, we do not yet know. And in her place, another woman was made to wear the bridal veil, to walk down the aisle, to take the vows." He turned sharply. "And I believe that woman is still among us." Gasps erupted. Someone knocked over a glass. I, for one, could scarcely comprehend the enormity of his claim. "Poirot," I said in a hushed voice, "you mean to say that the impostor never left?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Mais oui, mon ami. She is here. And now," he lifted a hand, "she shall reveal herself." The silence was unbearable. A single log in the fireplace shifted, sending a crackle of embers into the air. My heart pounded. Then quite suddenly, Lady Eleanor rose from her chair. Her face was white as parchment, her hands trembling as she gripped the back of her seat. "This is madness," she whispered. "You have no proof at all." Poirot turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Madame, you intercepted a letter meant for Mademoiselle Lillian, did you not? You feared for her safety, and yet—" "You chose to keep the truth hidden." "Why?" She shook her head wildly. I wanted to protect her. I did not know. I never imagined." Poirot held up a gloved hand. "And yet the warning note was yours, was it not? You wrote to Mademoiselle Lillian, advising her not to trust a certain person. Tell us, madame, who was it that she should not trust?" Lady Eleanor faltered. Then slowly she sank back into her chair, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Poirot
turned away, his gaze sweeping the room. Someone here had great reason to ensure that Mademoiselle Lillian never reached the altar.
But I ask you, why the deception? Why not simply make her disappear? Why go through the charade of a false wedding? His eyes locked on to Lord Strathmore. The groom flinched. What are you implying? He demanded. I imply, mon cher, that
there was something of great value to be gained by ensuring that Lillian Harrow was seen to be married, even if she herself was not truly present. Lord Strathmore's mouth opened, then closed. Poirot took a slow step forward. A marriage binds two families, does it not? It secures fortunes, estates, and obligations. I begin to wonder, was there some clause, some arrangement, that made the marriage imperative? Lady Eleanor let out a strangled sob. The inheritance, she whispered. Poirot inclined his head. Bien sûr. The Harrow fortune, controlled, I suspect, by conditions unknown to us. And now we have an impostor who has signed the marriage register in Mademoiselle Lillian's place. He turned sharply. And where is the real Lillian Harrow? The question hung in the air, heavy.
As a death sentence, no one moved, no one spoke. Poirot's gaze swept the room one last time before he gave a small nod. Ladies and gentlemen, we have uncovered the deception, but now we must find the truth, and I promise you— His eyes darkened. I shall not rest until I do.
Chapter 12. The Criminal's Mistake. The drawing-room still hummed with unease long after Poirot's pronouncement. Faces were pale, hands clutched at armrests, and glances flickered like candle flames between those gathered. But Poirot, ever methodical, had already turned his attention elsewhere. "Hastings," he murmured, stepping aside and motioning for me to follow. "It is time we return to the scene of the crime." "The crime?" I asked, matching his pace as he strode purposefully toward the grand staircase. "But we don't even know what crime has been committed. Lillian Harrow has vanished, yes, but murder, abduction, deception, certainly, but—" Poirot raised a finger. "Ah, but what is deception, mon ami, if not a crime in itself? Someone has gone to great lengths to weave an illusion, and I intend to pull every thread until the truth stands bare." We ascended the stairs, the thick carpet swallowing our footfalls. The corridor leading to Lillian's dressing room was silent, the air heavy with the ghost of recent events. Poirot paused before the door, then pushed it open, stepping inside with a meticulous grace. The room remained undisturbed since our last visit. A faint perfume lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of polished wood and aging fabric. The vanity still bore traces of hurried preparation, a forgotten hairpin, a smudge of powder on the glass. But Poirot's gaze was fixed elsewhere. He moved toward the rug near the window, kneeling with unexpected ease and running his fingers lightly over its surface. "Regardez, Hastings," he murmured. "Do you see?" I crouched beside him, frowning, as I followed his line of sight. At first I saw nothing. Then as I shifted, the light caught a subtle irregularity, a small tear in the otherwise impeccable weave of the carpet. It was no more than an inch long, but the fibres were pulled unnaturally, as if by force. Poirot nodded to himself. "Ah,
Struggle," he murmured. "Or an accident?" I felt my pulse quicken. "Do you think Lillian was taken by force?" Poirot did not answer immediately.
Instead, he withdrew a small envelope from his pocket, pinched a speck of dust from the frayed edge of the tear, and carefully tucked it away. Then, leaning closer, He inhaled slightly. His moustache twitched. His eyes darkened. "Chloroform," he announced. A chill ran through me. "Chloroform?" Poirot rose to his feet. "May we? A faint trace but unmistakable. Someone was rendered unconscious here, and I suspect it was none other than Mademoiselle Lillian." I struggled to piece the implications together. "But
If she was unconscious, then she didn't leave willingly. She was taken." Poirot gave a satisfied nod. "Precisely." A new urgency seized me. "Then we've no time to lose."
we must tell the authorities." "Patience, Hastings." Poirot's voice was firm but not unkind. "We must first understand the method, and to do so we must return to those who served her." I hesitated. "You mean the lady's maid?"
"Alice?" No, Hastings, not Alice, the one who is missing." I blinked. Of course, I had nearly forgotten. The other maid, the one whose absence had been noted but not yet explained. "Do we know her name?" Poirot clasped his hands behind,
his back deep in thought. "Marie Delacroix," he said at last. She had been with the household for just under a year. Quiet, diligent, but of late behaving most strangely. I frowned. "Who told you that?" "The servants." Poirot gave me a pointed look. "They notice everything, Hastings, though they do not always know what it is they see." A soft knock interrupted us. We turned to find one of the footmen lingering at the door, his expression uncertain. "Monsieur Poirot," he said hesitantly, "you asked earlier about Miss Lillian's maid, Marie Delacroix. I thought you should know. She left the estate that morning, said she was feeling unwell." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Did she say where she was going?" The footman shook his head. "No, sir. But I did find something strange in the servants' hall." He stepped forward, holding out a small, folded slip of paper. Poirot took it, unfolded it carefully, and read aloud. "It is too dangerous. I cannot stay. Forgive me." A tense silence followed. Poirot's eyes flicked up, bright with interest. "Where did you find this?" "Tucked into the corner of the hearth, sir," as if it had been dropped in haste. Poirot studied the note again, then handed it to me. The writing was hurried but elegant, the ink slightly smudged at the edges. "It is a woman's hand," I observed. Poirot nodded. "And one that trembled when it wrote this message." He turned to the footman. "Merci, my good friend. You have been most helpful." As the footman departed, I turned to Poirot in mounting excitement. Then Marie knew something. She fled because she was afraid. "Oui, Hastings, and that tells us two things. First, she was not working alone. Someone else was involved, someone powerful enough to make her fear for her life. Second," Poirot paused, his expression unreadable. "Second, Marie may still be in grave danger." I swallowed hard. "You think she could be—" "Silenced?" Poirot finished, his tone grim. "It is possible." A heavy weight settled in my chest. "Then we must find her." Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "Indeed, and I believe we shall. But first, we must uncover one final piece of the puzzle." I raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Why go to such lengths to replace Mademoiselle Lillian? What secret did she hold that was worth such deception?" "My friend, the criminal has made a mistake. And once I have found it—" He gave a small, satisfied smile. "The whole facade shall crumble." The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing flickering shadows along the walls. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked on its hinges. The mystery was tightening around us, and yet I could not shake the sensation that we were still only at the edge of a much darker truth. Poirot folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Come, Hastings. The next move is ours. Chapter 13. The Trap. The house was unusually quiet that evening. A tense hush had settled over Harrow Hall, as if its very walls held their breath in anticipation. Poirot had ensured that news of his supposed discovery spread swiftly through the household, an artful deception designed to lure the guilty from their hiding place. "Mon ami," he murmured to me as we took our positions outside Lillian's dressing room. This is the moment when the mouse ventures forth, believing the cat has stepped away. But, it is a most clever cat, n'est-ce pas? I nodded, though my pulse thrummed with excitement. We had dimmed the lights in the corridor and waited in the shadows, our presence masked by the heavy velvet drapery near the staircase. Poirot's plan was simple, yet effective. Make it known that a significant clue had been found in Lillian's room, and then watch for who would come to retrieve or destroy it. The minutes stretched on, each one slow and silent. My nerves were taut, my
hand resting near the revolver Poirot had insisted I bring.
Then, at last, the faintest sound, a careful, deliberate footstep on the carpet. Poirot placed a hand on my arm, his touch barely perceptible. I followed his gaze. The door to Lillian's room was opening, inch by inch, with the agonizing stealth of a practiced hand. A shadow flitted across the threshold, then a figure slipped inside, moving swiftly in the near darkness. Poirot gave me the signal. We stepped forward. The moment our presence was known, the intruder gave a startled gasp and
whirled around.
The light from the hallway fell upon her face, and I barely stifled a cry of astonishment. It was Claire, the quiet, unassuming lady's maid. Her eyes darted wildly about the room, seeking an escape, but Poirot was already blocking the door. With a sigh of resignation, she sank into the nearest chair, her hands clutched together in her lap. "Well, well, mademoiselle," Poirot said, dusting his hands neatly. "It seems the cat has caught the mouse after all." Claire did not speak. Her breathing was uneven, and I could see the sheen of perspiration at her temples. Poirot closed the door and stepped closer, his voice soft but unyielding. "I will tell you what I believe, and you may then tell me if I am wrong, oui?" She flinched, but gave the barest of nods. "Someone approached you, offering a sum of money in exchange for your silence and for your assistance," Poirot began. "You were to play a small role in a grand deception, a simple task, really, to help another woman take the place of Mademoiselle Lillian on the day of the wedding." Claire's lips parted, but she remained mute. Poirot continued, his tone almost kind. "At first you did not question it. The woman, whoever she was, resembled your mistress well enough, yes? And perhaps you were told that it was for Mademoiselle Lillian's own safety. But tell me, mademoiselle, when did you realize the truth? That Lillian Harrow was not merely hiding, but had disappeared entirely?" Claire swallowed hard. Her fingers twisted in the folds of her dress. I leaned forward, barely able to contain my impatience. "Was it Marie Delacroix who involved you in this?" I demanded. "Or someone else?" At the mention of the missing maid's name, Claire stiffened. For a moment, I thought she would refuse to speak at all. But then, in a whisper so low I almost missed it, she said, "They told me she had left." Poirot's gaze sharpened.
"Who told you?" Claire hesitated, as if realizing she had already said too much. I don't know," she stammered. "It was all arranged through letters, anonymous ones. They instructed me on what to do and when."
Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And how much were you paid?" Claire let out a bitter laugh. £50? I could not hide my shock. Only 50 for such a scheme? Her eyes burned with quiet humiliation. At the time it seemed a fortune. Poirot gave a sympathetic sigh. Ah, mademoiselle, and now you see the cost was much greater than you imagined. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear it. I thought I was helping her. Poirot studied her intently, then gave the smallest nod, as if weighing the truth in her words. Very well, he said at last. But tell me one thing, Claire. If you believed you were helping Lillian, why are you here now, rifling through her room? Claire's expression crumpled. Because I'm afraid, she admitted. I overheard something I
wasn't meant to hear. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. Go on.
Claire hesitated only a second longer before she blurted out, Marie didn't leave. She was taken. A chill ran through me. Poirot, too, was motionless, his eyes glinting like polished steel. Taken? He repeated. Claire gave a shuddering breath. The night before the wedding, I heard voices near the servants' entrance. One of them was Marie's. She was arguing with someone, a man. She sounded frightened. She said she wouldn't go through with it, that it was too dangerous. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to block out the memory. And then I heard a scuffle, a muffled cry, and nothing after that. Poirot inhaled sharply. You saw nothing? Claire shook her head. By the time I got there, the corridor was empty. But the next morning, when I asked where Marie was, they told me she had fallen ill and left. She swallowed. I didn't believe it then, and I certainly don't believe it now. A silence fell over the room, thick with unspoken fears. Poirot straightened, his face unreadable. Then, with a sudden, sharp precision, he turned on his heel and strode toward the dressing table. He ran his fingers lightly over its surface, then reached down, feeling along the underside. His expression changed. Ah, he murmured. So that is how it is. I rushed to his side. What? What is it? Poirot withdrew his hand, and in his palm lay a small, delicate key. It gleamed in the candlelight, its surface worn but still whole. Claire gasped. That? Poirot regarded her carefully. You recognize it, mademoiselle? She nodded, her breath shallow. It's Marie's. It opens her private trunk. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. Then I think, Hastings, he said quietly, that we must see what secrets Marie Delacroix left behind. A hush fell over the room. The weight
of the revelation pressed heavily upon us. Somewhere within this house, hidden from sight, was the truth. The final piece of a cruel deception.
And perhaps, if we were not too late, the key to finding both Marie Delacroix and the missing bride. Poirot turned to Claire, his voice softer now. You have been misled, mademoiselle, but you may still do the right thing. She nodded wordlessly. Poirot slipped the key into his pocket, then without another word, he strode toward the door. The game, he murmured, is nearly at an end. Chapter 14. The Real Culprit. The silence in Lillian's dressing room was heavy, thick with the weight
of what had just been revealed.
Claire sat motionless, her face pale as she wrung her hands together. Poirot, ever composed, studied her with that piercing gaze of his, as if he were peeling back the layers of deception one by one. So, he murmured at last, his voice barely above a whisper. You were not acting alone, mademoiselle? Claire hesitated, then shook her head, defeated. No. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. Who gave you the orders? Who put this entire scheme in motion? She swallowed hard before she spoke the name that sent a shiver through me, Lord Strathmore. A silence followed, thick and suffocating. Poirot's expression did not change, though his eyes gleamed with something sharp and knowing. I, however, was unable to contain my astonishment. "Strathmore!" I burst out. "But why? What motive could he possibly have to—" Poirot held up a hand to silence me. His attention remained fixed on Claire. "Tell me everything, mademoiselle."
Leave nothing out. She exhaled shakily. I didn't understand it at first. It started with letters, instructions, money. I was to follow certain orders without question, help someone take Lillian's place. I thought perhaps it was
All some strange game. That Miss Lillian had planned it herself, for some reason. Poirot inclined his head slightly. And when did you realize the truth? Claire's throat bobbed as she swallowed. After the wedding, when the impostor
ran away.
Hastings and I exchanged stunned glances. She fled? I repeated. Claire nodded. She panicked. Something went wrong, something she hadn't anticipated. And when she disappeared, suddenly there was no bride at all. That's when I knew. The real Miss Lillian had never been part of this at all. She had been taken somewhere, hidden. Poirot steepled his fingers. And it was Lord Strathmore who orchestrated it? A slow nod. Yes, the implications of her words settled over
us like a suffocating fog.
Hastings, his face dark with anger, spoke first. The scoundrel! He must have known about her inheritance. Claire flinched, but nodded. He needed a legal wedding, she murmured. With a signed marriage certificate, he could claim everything.
That was hers. That's why he arranged for a woman who looked like Lillian to take her place. No one would have questioned it, not until it was too late. I turned to Poirot, my mind racing. But why go to such lengths? Surely a man like
Strathmore. Poirot cut me off with a sharp glance. A man like Strathmore, mon cher Hastings, is precisely the kind to go to such lengths. He is wealthy, yes, but not enough. His estates are in debt, his investments unwise. He was in desperate need of funds. He gestured towards Claire. And Mademoiselle Lillian, thanks to her late father, had inherited a considerable fortune. The pieces were beginning to fit together, though I could hardly believe the audacity of it. Poirot, ever methodical, pressed on. Tell me, Claire, where is she? Claire's breath caught.
I don't know. I swear it. I was never told where she was taken. I only know that she was drugged before the wedding. That was Marie's job. My stomach turned. And now Marie is missing. A flicker of something, perhaps guilt, crossed Claire's face.
Yes, Poirot's gaze did not waver. And the impostor, who was she? Claire hesitated, but in the end she shook her head. I never learned her name. She was brought here in secret days before the wedding. She was trained to move, like Lillian, to speak like her. But I only ever saw her in shadows, in hurried moments. She let out a bitter laugh. She looked like her, enough that no one would have noticed the difference, until it was too late. Poirot tapped his fingers lightly against his chin. And yet she fled. Claire nodded, her lips pressing together. She must have realized that something was amiss, that she was being used just as I was. Maybe she feared what would happen.
Once Strathmore had what he wanted, Poirot let out a contemplative hum. Ah, how very curious. A scheme so carefully constructed, and yet the human element, always so unpredictable, causes its unravelling. Hastings frowned. But, Poirot, if Strathmore needed the marriage to be official, why go to all this trouble? Why not simply force Lillian to go through with it herself? Poirot shook his head. Non, non, mon ami, that would be too dangerous. A bride forced to marry against her will, that would raise suspicion. The impersonator, however, would sign the documents willingly.
And once it was done, he made a small, dismissive gesture with his hand. The real Lillian could be disposed of. A terrible silence fell. Claire clenched her hands. "I didn't know that part," she whispered. I never thought—" Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "But you know it now, and you must help us find her." Claire hesitated only a moment before nodding. Poirot exhaled, his keen eyes dark with thought. Then suddenly he turned to me. "Hastings, mon ami, we must act at once. Lord Strathmore will soon realize his plan is crumbling, and when he does, he may attempt to rid himself of the one loose thread." I stiffened. "You mean—" "Yes," Poirot said grimly. "If Lillian is still alive, she is in grave danger." At that moment, footsteps sounded in the corridor, a heavy, deliberate tread. Poirot's head lifted slightly. He held up a finger for silence. A knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps. Poirot exchanged a glance with me, then strode forward, swinging the door open. Lord Strathmore stood there, his expression carefully composed, but his eyes dark, calculating. "Ah," Poirot said pleasantly, folding his hands behind his back. "Lord Strathmore, what a most unexpected—"
Visit! Strathmore's gaze flickered past him, landing on Claire.
She shrank back as if expecting a blow. For the briefest moment, something cruel flashed in Strathmore's eyes. Then just as quickly it was gone. "I was told there was some disturbance," he said smoothly. "I thought I might be of assistance." Poirot smiled. "Ah, but of course, monsieur, you are always most helpful." He stepped aside slightly, motioning Strathmore into the room. For the first time, I saw something flicker in the man's expression, something uncertain. Poirot tilted his
Head.
"Please, do come in. After all, I believe we have much to discuss." The drawing-room was silent, save for the distant ticking of the mantel clock. The assembled guests, suspects rather, shifted in their seats, their expressions ranging from anxious to impatient. Lord Strathmore sat near the fireplace, his face composed, but his fingers betraying him as they tapped idly against the arm of his chair. Lady Eleanor sat apart, her chin raised in defiance, though a shadow of unease flickered behind her eyes. Poirot stood at the centre of the room, hands neatly folded, his gaze sweeping across them all with quiet authority. Hastings and I watched from the side, waiting, as always, for the great detective to weave the final strands of his intricate web. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice calm yet commanding, "the time has come to remove the final veil from this mystery. We now know why Mademoiselle Lillian vanished, how it was done, and who orchestrated this most ambitious deception." A hush settled over the room. Lord Strathmore exhaled, feigning boredom. "This is all very dramatic, Poirot, but you still haven't answered the one question that truly matters. Where is my wife?" A slow smile curled at Poirot's lips. "Ah, you would like to know that, n'est-ce pas? But let us begin at the beginning." He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Lady Eleanor. "Madame, from the very first, I observed something most curious about you. You were distressed, but not in the manner of a grieving stepmother. No, you feared something, not loss, but discovery. Lady Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. Poirot turned sharply, his eyes landing on Claire, the maid. And then we had you, mademoiselle. You confessed your role in this deception, how you helped to place an impostor in Mademoiselle Lillian's stead. A murmur rippled through the room, though none dared to interrupt him. And yet, Poirot continued, pacing slowly, there was one flaw in the plan, a flaw that led to its unravelling. The impostor, you see, was meant to remain. She was to sign the marriage register, to fulfill the necessary requirements of the law, but instead she vanished. Lord Strathmore exhaled in exasperation. Yes, you've said all this before. Where is she? Poirot's gaze snapped to him, sharp as steel. Patience, my lord. He let the silence stretch before he continued, his voice deliberate. Let us return to the question at the heart of this case. Where was the real Lillian Harrow on the day of her wedding? A few exchanged uneasy glances. She was not at the altar, Poirot answered himself.
No, she was elsewhere, hidden away. But where? Poirot allowed a brief pause before delivering his revelation. A remote hunting lodge, one that belongs to this very estate. A gasp came from Lady Eleanor, though she quickly covered her
mouth with her hand. Strathmore's face remained impassive. And how do you know this? Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, folded scrap of paper. Because, my lord, I have seen it with my own eyes. Hastings, Inspector Davis, and I paid a visit to the lodge this morning. The room seemed to freeze. She was there, Lady Eleanor breathed. Poirot nodded solemnly. Mademoiselle Lillian was found alive but weak. She had been drugged, kept in a locked room, but by some mercy she was unharmed. He turned to Strathmore. You see, my lord, the plan was quite brilliant, except for one thing. You never expected your impostor to panic. For the first time, something flickered in Strathmore's expression. She was meant to remain, Poirot continued, his voice smooth. She was meant to marry you in every legal sense, after which the real Lillian could be, how shall we say, removed.
And then, as her grieving husband, you would inherit her vast fortune. Lady Eleanor gasped. The others stared at Strathmore in horror. Poirot's eyes gleamed. But she ran, and with her gone, the wedding was incomplete. Your plan, my lord?
Collapsed like a house of cards. A silence followed, thick and suffocating. Then Lady Eleanor, her face pale but resolute, spoke at last. I knew something was wrong. All eyes turned to her. I had my suspicions, she said quietly. I never trusted Strathmore, not with Lillian. And when I overheard part of a conversation between him and Marie, I knew he was up to something. That's why I intercepted the letter meant for Lillian. That's why I sent the warning. Her voice shook, but she lifted her chin. But I was too late. Poirot inclined his head slightly. And yet, madame, you did what you could. You tried to protect her. Lady Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth as though trying to suppress a sob. Strathmore let out a dry laugh, though his expression was tight. Very moving, Lady Eleanor. But you have no proof. Poirot raised a brow. Ah, my lord, but I do. Turned to Inspector Davis, who had been standing quietly by the door. The officer reached into his pocket and produced a document. A forged marriage certificate, Poirot announced, taking the paper and unfolding it carefully. One that you, my lord, had prepared in advance. You thought the impersonator would sign, but when she disappeared, you were forced to alter. The document to make it appear as though Lillian had married you before vanishing. Strathmore's mask cracked for just a moment. Poirot's voice grew softer, but no less sharp. Alas, there was one fatal mistake, my lord. The signature on this document, it does not match Mademoiselle Lillian's hand.
A stunned silence followed. Poirot let the words sink in before he continued, his voice almost playful. A crime, mon ami, is like a wedding cake. Many layers, but always one truth at the centre. Strathmore rose abruptly, his chair scraping
Against the floor. His composure was gone now, his face twisted in rage. You meddling little... Inspector Davis stepped forward. That's quite enough, my lord. Strathmore turned sharply, but the glint of handcuffs was enough to make him hesitate. Poirot stepped forward, looking at him with something almost like pity. It was greed, n'est-ce pas? Greed that led you to believe you could construct the perfect illusion. But illusions, my lord, cannot last. Strathmore clenched his jaw, but he did not resist as Davis placed the cuffs around his wrists. As the inspector led him away, a strange, heavy quiet filled the room. Poirot turned to Lady Eleanor, his voice gentle. Mademoiselle Lillian will...
Need you when she wakes? Lady Eleanor nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Poirot dusted off his hands, then turned to me with a smile.
And so, mon cher Hastings, the case is closed. I exhaled a breath I had not realized I was holding. You certainly know how to put on a show, Poirot. He twirled the end of his moustache, eyes twinkling. Ah, but of course, every mystery must have its grand reveal. The night air was crisp as Poirot and I stepped outside, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. The case was closed, Strathmore was in police custody, and the rightful bride was safe. Yet, even as we left the estate, I found myself marvelling at the complexity of it all. The deception, the layers upon layers of trickery. It had been one of Poirot's finest cases. Inside, Lady Eleanor remained at Lillian's bedside. Her cold reserve melted into something softer as she clutched the young woman's hand. Lillian was pale, weak from her ordeal, but her eyes held a quiet strength. I don't know how to thank you, Monsieur Poirot, she murmured, as we took our leave. I was certain no one would find me. Poirot inclined his head. Mademoiselle, there is always a way to the truth. One must only listen to what the facts whisper. She smiled faintly, her fingers tightening around the blanket. I heard them whispering in the dark, you know, she said softly. The men who took me, they weren't meant to harm me, only to keep me quiet until it was over. But when she ran, when the false bride disappeared, they didn't know what to do with me. They were waiting for orders that never came. I shuddered at the thought. You were lucky, I said. Yes, she agreed. And I owe that luck to you, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot waved a hand modestly. No, mademoiselle, I merely followed the little grey cells where they led. As we stepped out into the night, I turned to Poirot. So that's the end of it, then? He gave me an amused glance. Ah, mon ami, you are always so eager for the final page of the book. But justice, Hastings, does not close with mere arrests.
And signatures. There will be trials, testimonies, the law. She must take her course. I sighed. Well, I, for one, am ready for a quiet evening. Poirot chuckled. And so you shall have one, Hastings. Come, let us return to London. We
took the evening train, the rhythmic clatter of the rails lulling us into a comfortable silence. Poirot, as was his custom, busied himself with straightening an already pristine pocket square. I, on the other hand, was lost in thought. What are you thinking, mon ami? Poirot asked after some time, his voice rich with amusement. I exhaled. It was a rather brilliant plan, you know, if it had worked. The perfect crime, nearly. Ah, but you see, Hastings, there is no such thing as the perfect crime. Poirot wagged a finger. A man may plan, he may be clever, he may anticipate, but always there is a detail, a flaw, a moment where he overlooks what he should not. I leaned back in my seat. And Strathmore's flaw? Poirot smiled. His impatience. He waited but a little longer, had he not rushed to forge the certificate, had he not sent his foolish maid to retrieve that which he believed lost? Then perhaps he might have succeeded. I shook my head. And what of Lady Eleanor? Do you believe she truly meant to protect Lilian? Poirot gave a small shrug. Hastings, the human heart is a most curious thing. A stepmother, yes, but one who was also a guardian. She may not have loved the girl, but she had no desire to see her harmed, and in the end, even she could not remain silent. I watched the countryside slip by outside the window, dark fields illuminated by the moon's glow. I wonder what will happen to Lilian now. Poirot smiled gently. She will recover, Hastings. She will be free to live the life she chooses, not one dictated by greed. The train continued on, and as the lights of London drew near, I found myself relaxing at last. Another case solved. Another truth uncovered. Poirot, as if sensing my thoughts, patted my arm. Mon ami, the little grey cells, they never fail. I laughed. No, Poirot, they never do. And with that, we rode on into the night, content in the knowledge that justice had, once again, been served.